Washington, D.C. was busy like always. Cars moved fast in the streets. People walked quickly, going to work or meetings. But today, there was a different feeling in the air. Something important was going to happen at the White House. A meeting was planned, a meeting that many people were talking about. It was a meeting between two important men, Mr. Donald Trump and Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky. Inside the White House, people were getting ready. Staff members walked around checking things. They made sure the rooms were tidy and everything was in place. This was a big day and everything had to be perfect. The meeting room was prepared. Chairs were set around a large table. Bottles of water and notepads were placed neatly. It looked serious and ready for important talks. This meeting was happening because of a big problem in the world. A war was going on in Ukraine. Ukraine is a country in Europe, and it was at war with Russia. This war had been going on for a long time, and it was very serious. Many people were hurt and many cities were damaged. The war was not just a problem for Ukraine and Russia. It was a problem for the whole world. Many countries were watching what was happening in Ukraine. They were worried about the war getting bigger. They wanted the war to stop. The United States, a very powerful country, was also very interested in this war. The US had given help to Ukraine, but they wanted to find a way to end the fighting. Let's think about the background to this meeting. The war in Ukraine was a big and complex situation. It started many years ago, but it became much worse more recently. Russia had sent soldiers into Ukraine, and fighting had been going on ever since. Ukraine wanted to protect its land and its people. Many countries around the world supported Ukraine, but stopping the war was very hard. Before this meeting, both Mr. Trump and Mr. Zelensky had their own positions. Mr. Zelensky's main position was clear. He needed help to defend Ukraine and to end the war in a way that was good for his country. He wanted security guarantees for Ukraine so that this kind of thing would not happen again in the future. He was thankful for the help Ukraine had already received, but he knew more was needed. No one knew for sure what would come out of this meeting. But everyone agreed it was important. It was a chance for two important leaders to talk face to face about a very serious problem. It was a moment that could have big consequences for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the world. As the time for the meeting got closer, the anticipation grew even stronger. The world held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in the White House meeting room. A meeting was planned, and now it was almost time for the talking to begin. The door to the meeting room opened. It was a big, impressive room in the White House. The walls were painted in a light color, and there were large windows letting in the bright sunshine from outside. The room felt important, a place where serious things happened. Everyone who entered knew this was not just a normal room. This was a place of power and decision-making. Mr. Donald Trump was already in the room. He stood tall and looked around as Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky entered. Mr. Trump was known for his strong presence. He often wore a suit and a red tie, and today was no different. He had a confident look on his face, ready for the meeting to begin. He waited near the large table, ready to greet his guest. Mr. Zelensky walked into the room with his team. He was dressed in his usual style, not a suit, but simple, comfortable clothes, maybe a bit like what soldiers wear. This was how people often saw him, and it reminded everyone that he was a leader in a country at war. He looked serious but also polite as he came into the room. He knew this meeting was very important for Ukraine. "Mr. President Zelensky," Mr. Trump said, his voice clear and strong, "welcome to the White House. It is a real honor to have you here with us today." His words were formal but sounded friendly. He wanted to make Mr. Zelensky feel welcome, even though the topics they were going to discuss were very serious. Mr. Zelensky smiled slightly and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. President Trump," he replied. His voice was also clear, but perhaps a little more careful. He spoke English, but it was clear it was not his first language. "Thank you for the invitation. It is important for me to be here." Mr. Trump gestured towards the table. "Please come and sit down," he said. "Let's get comfortable and we can start talking." Earlier, the atmosphere had been mostly formal, with moments of polite agreement and serious discussion. But as the conversation moved into its later stages, a shift started to happen. The air in the room began to feel different. A subtle tension was creeping in, like a quiet hum that was slowly getting louder. This change became really noticeable when a reporter, a man named JD, was given a chance to ask a question. JD was from a news outlet known for asking direct, sometimes challenging questions. He stood up slightly, holding his microphone, and addressed both Mr. Trump and Mr. Zelensky, but his question was clearly aimed more at Mr. Zelensky. Mr. President Zelensky, JD began, his voice clear and quite assertive. With respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media right now. His words were strong, almost accusatory. He was suggesting that Mr. Zelensky was using the meeting for his own purposes in front of the press, rather than engaging in genuine discussion. JD continued, his voice still firm. You guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. This was a direct and critical statement about Ukraine's military situation. He was bringing up a sensitive issue, suggesting Ukraine was having difficulties and was resorting to forceful methods to get soldiers. Then he added, with a tone that sounded almost like scolding, you should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict. This was the core of his question, or rather, his statement. He was implying that Mr. Zelensky was not showing enough gratitude to Mr. Trump for his efforts to resolve the war. It was a question framed as a criticism, suggesting Zelensky was unappreciative and out of line. Mr. Zelensky reacted to JD's question with a visible change in his expression. He looked surprised, maybe a little taken aback by the direct and critical nature of the question. He paused for a moment before responding, choosing his words carefully. What problems we have, Mr. Zelensky responded, his voice calm but with an edge of defensiveness. I have been to Ukraine. Come on. He was directly challenging JD's assertion about Ukraine's problems, inviting him to see the reality for himself. He was pushing back against what he perceived as an unfair and perhaps uninformed comment. He then began to explain Ukraine's position. First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have a nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless you don't know that. God bless you will not have war. He was trying to broaden the perspective, pointing out that everyone faces problems in war, even powerful nations. He also made a somewhat pointed comment about the US and the potential for future conflict, perhaps suggesting a shared vulnerability despite geographical distance. JD interrupted him, his tone becoming even more accusatory. Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good. We're going to feel influential. JD's interruption was sharp and dismissive. He was shutting down Mr. Zelensky's attempt to broaden the perspective and was re-centering the focus on what he saw as Ukraine's failings and lack of appreciation. At this point, Mr. Trump intervened more directly. He seemed to pick up on the confrontational tone and the opportunity to steer the conversation in a direction he wanted. He leaned forward, addressing Mr. Zelensky, and his tone shifted noticeably. It became less welcoming and more critical, echoing JD's line of questioning. You're right now not in a very good position, Mr. Trump said, his voice now firmer, almost lecturing. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about from the very beginning of the war. You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now with us. Trump was directly agreeing with JD's critical assessment. He was emphasizing Ukraine's perceived weakness and dependence on the US. He continued, You're playing cards, you're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War I, you're gambling with World War III, and what you're doing is very disrespectful to this country that's backed you far more than a lot of people said they should have. Trump's language became even stronger. He accused Zelensky of gambling and being disrespectful. He was highlighting the US support and again implying a lack of gratitude from Ukraine. Then came the direct accusation about thankfulness. "Have you said thank you once this entire meeting?" Mr. Trump asked, his voice almost challenging. "In this entire meeting, have you said thank you?" This was a direct and personal accusation. He was fixating on the idea of gratitude and suggesting Zelensky had failed to express it adequately. He went even further, mentioning a past event. "You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October." This was a reference to something that had happened previously, and Mr. Trump brought it up as another example of perceived disrespect or ingratitude. He was adding to the list of grievances, making the atmosphere even more tense. Mr. Zelensky, faced with this barrage of criticism and accusations, tried to respond again. He was trying to explain his perspective, to defend Ukraine, but it was becoming increasingly difficult in the face of the escalating tension. Mr. Trump interrupted him sharply, not letting him finish. "He's not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly," Mr. Trump retorted, dismissing Zelensky's attempt to explain himself. "I know you're not winning. You're not winning this. I tell you, you have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us." He was reiterating his view that Ukraine was in a weak position and any chance of success was only due to US support. He was making it clear that he felt Ukraine should be more appreciative and less critical, in his view. The exchange continued in this vein, becoming less of a discussion and more of a heated back and forth. Mr. Zelensky tried to assert that Ukraine was staying strong, that they were thankful, but his words were often met with interruptions and further criticisms from both JD and Mr. Trump. "Mr. President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war," Mr. Zelensky managed to say, attempting to get his point across amidst the interruptions. "We've been alone and we are thankful. I said thanks in this cabinet, in this cab." Mr. Trump cut him off again, not wanting to hear further explanation. "We gave you through this stupid president $350 billion. We gave you military equipment." He was emphasizing the financial and material support from the US, almost as a way of underlining what he felt was owed in return gratitude and compliance. The tension in the room was now palpable. The disagreement was not just about policy or strategy, it was about respect, gratitude, and differing perspectives on the reality of the war. The clash of communication styles was also evident. JD was direct and accusatory, Trump was assertive and demanding, and Zelensky was trying to remain composed and explain his position under increasing pressure. Finally, Mr. Trump seemed to decide that the exchange had gone on long enough. Perhaps sensing that it was becoming unproductive, or maybe feeling he had made his point, he started to wind down the argument. He made a final statement about the need for gratitude and the difficulty of doing business in this atmosphere. "It's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this," Mr. Trump stated, summing up his frustration. Just say thank you, accept American people, accept that there are disagreements, and let's go litigate those disagreements rather than trying to fight it out in the American media when you're wrong. We know that you're wrong." He was reiterating his demand for gratitude and his view that Zelensky was in the wrong in some way. The heated exchange began to subside. The immediate argument was over, but the tension lingered in the air. The clash had revealed deeper disagreements and made the atmosphere in the room noticeably strained. The initial politeness and hope for agreement had been overshadowed by a confrontation that highlighted the complex and sometimes uncomfortable realities of international relations and wartime alliances. The question of gratitude, the perception of weakness, and the different ways of viewing the conflict had all been brought sharply into focus, leaving a palpable tension hanging in the air as the meeting moved towards its conclusion.